There are multiple ways to keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast. Through our Instagram handle, the Wolf Connection Pod, and for comments and questions, send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some wolves. Yet another individual whom I had the pleasure of meeting at the International Wolf Symposium. And once again, as we've been talking about with any of these guests from that wonderful event, is that they had such very little time to discuss their awesome topics and research and curriculums, which we'll be talking about today. So this is good that we have this awesome podcast and that they can come on and do this. So this is Jordyn O'Gara. She recently graduated from the University of Minnesota Duluth Center for Environmental Education. She has her master's in environmental education and also a bachelor's in natural resources. Jordyn, awesome to see you again. How you doing?
Pretty good. How about yourself?
Doing great. Yeah, we were looking through all this and there's a lot to get to. So, and we really want you to explain that because you, like I said, there was a lot. I think you received a standing ovation because of just the overall concept of this curriculum and what it's intended to do, and we want to get into that. So how did you get to this point of wanting to work in environmental education and veering off into wolves and wanting people and the populace to take this on and study this in a different landscape?
I grew up in Minnesota in the Twin Cities area, but spent most of my childhood up in the Northwoods. Most of my extended families from northern Minnesota, Wisconsin area. So we'd go hiking and camping up north all the time. I grew up with a husky and a Malamute, which if you've ever seen them, look a lot like wolves. And my parents had wolf art all over our house. So it was kind of ingrained in me as a little kid. I have been obsessed with nature in general since I could talk. So pretty obvious that I was going to go into anything environmental. It went from being an exotics vet to being a zoologist to being a wildlife biologist. So it bounced around a lot, but I went to an environmentally specialized high school here in the Twin Cities. And then that led me to Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin. That's a private environmental college. That's where I got into wildlife research. Originally was doing gray fox research, and then did an internship at the International Wolf Center in Ely, Minnesota as an education intern, which was entertaining at first because I was terrified of public speaking and then had to do presentations in front of 200 people. But I loved it. I started doing wolf research back at my college with my professor, Eric Olson. We did acoustic triangulation. So we took howling survey techniques and modified them to use that technique to locate wolves on the landscape. So did research for 2 years, actually led to a publication in April of 2020 as we published that work. It's this nonprofit called the Timberwolf Alliance, located on Northland College's grounds. I did some volunteer work with them my senior year, and then eventually did a fellowship with them when I graduated, a 6-month fellowship as their coordinator, which then turned into a 3-year-long position with them, doing education throughout northern Wisconsin and the UP. Was really in love with it. I did kind of all aspects. Being the coordinator, I did education programs, budgeting, designing programs, all of it. And a big thing that I learned through that work is there's a pretty big gap between science and education, especially when it comes to natural resources and large carnivores. So I've done a lot of amazing work with DNR, Wildlife Services, different federal agencies. They do great research, but they don't typically have the backing of the public. Taking that information and bring it to the public in a way that they're going to understand. The public tends to turn a blind eye to science and kind of be scared of science. So that's when I turned more to environmental education and found my master's program at UMD and started to pursue my master's in environmental education. And then because of all the wolf work that I've already done, it just more wolf work for my thesis. The typical thesis for an education master's is more of a curriculum design than it is research. So that's why I decided to pursue that avenue. So, and then it's turned into all this.
And that's great, Jordyn. I'm so glad that we're glad that you're in this environmental education space. What's the ultimate goal for the curriculum? Where is it going to be featured, or where do you envision it being featured? Is it specifically public school, collegiate, things of that sort? Or are you talking about public forum?
Yeah, so the curriculum was designed to be adult level education and in the non-formal setting. That for the scope of my thesis, I purposely did kind of a smaller scope for target audience, just so I didn't make drive myself crazy. So, but it can be very easily adapted to other platforms like K through 12 education, either non-formal or formal education, and then also at college level education. Um, but where you get into that is you have to start meeting curriculum standards. So that would be a process for working with educators in that regard and adapting the curriculum. The kind of layout of the curriculum is designed to teach teachers about the subject that they will be implementing in their classrooms. So I don't expect an average person working at a nonprofit or whatever to be an expert on wolves. So this is laying the groundwork for a lot of the background material, providing those lesson plans for them so they don't have to reinvent the wheel or put in a bunch of research themselves. So they can feel confident teaching these subjects to their classroom in a way that's going to actually influence social behavior and social change. Because the goal of this is to negate negative perspectives on wolves and to deflate these myths about wolves that we have in our region as well as throughout the whole country and the world about wolves. Because as I'm sure you guys know, wolves are an extremely controversial topic.
So is this tied to a certain subject matter, or what subjects might this be tied to, or is it pretty fluid?
It's pretty fluid. A lot of people look at natural resources and statistics and things like that as science-based. But I see this as more of an English lesson in a lot of regards. A lot of the subjects that I cover, while they are science and facts and things like that, it's a lot of cultural perspectives. So I primarily look at Western culture because that's my background and my expertise. Ideally, this curriculum will grow beyond that. Next steps would be to work with Indigenous cultures to bring their perspectives into this curriculum. But like the first module, which I'm sure we'll get to, is about wolf and human interaction. And a lot of that relates to like folklore and different perspectives on wolves in that regard. So it's very much like sociocultural and English aspects.
Can you just, I mean, this might be a boring question, but how long did this take you? I mean, this seems like such a comprehensive guide to myths and folklore, more than we've seen before. It just describe the massive material you must have had to go through, or how did you approach research? How did you decide what materials were meaningful? Just describe the undertaking, really.
Actually, physically writing the curriculum, about 3 years to write it. To get all of the facts and material, I've been in the wolf world since I was 18, so about 8 years of just learning and absorbing and retaining information. My personal passion when it comes to wolf-human conflict is historic, talking about how negative interactions within like 17th, 18th century has led to folklore and myths which influence our society today. So perfect example, Little Red Riding Hood is a great example of like how we perceive wolves in our stories, gives them negative connotations, which then leads to potentially bad management of the species, things like that. So, but yeah, I've been involved in this for quite some time.
Wow. I think, Steve, I don't know if you think about this. This likens when I was in high school, this seems like almost a AP history type curriculum or course, because Steven's right. Looking through just that first module, a lot of the literature that you have there and a lot of the background and the backbone of everything that I think we as humans, at least civilized humans in the United States, understand wolves are or come from that background. How much of that, and you say, what do you say, 18th, 17th, 18th century is roughly where a lot of that starts. Was there a lot of, what did you find that we carried from Europe over to what is now North America, right? What were the things? Was it really just folklore? Were there a lot of interactions in historical Europe where wolves were going after humans? Was it mostly people grazing their sheep, that type of a thing? What really carried this hatred or these myths that eventually became folklore and fables over here?
Yeah. I would also like to point out, specifically with module 1, when I wrote that, it was like 3 times longer than what it is now.
Oh, wow.
My advisor was like, you need to dumb this down. You need to bring it back because no one's going to read this. And I had like 6 pages of graphs. Like I went very over the top with this section. So I'm very passionate about it. But yeah, in the 17th, 18th century, specifically in France, is a huge hot zone for conflict. There was a lot of quote unquote man-eating wolves within that region. There was a lot of conflict, but you have to look at factors that led to that. 1, rabies was very prevalent. 2, they didn't have a lot of natural prey sources because of overhunting. A lot of the ungulates had been wiped out within that region. So they were forced to come into human society and feed off of garbage, sheep, which is the primary source of livestock.
Makes sense.
Then you also have to look at agricultural practices. Most people had really big families and their kids were the ones out living with the sheep, manning them, having a lot of interactions with wildlife in general because they're outside all the time in these barren landscapes or these natural landscapes where predators are prevalent. So a lot of times what they encountered was a lot of people died from rabies. They would get bit by a wolf that was rabid and actually die from rabies, but they would associate it with a wolf attack. And then at the time, you also had a lot of wolf dog hybrids and captive wolves with not even close to the standards that we have now for keeping these animals in captivity. So a lot of them would escape, be extremely habituized to people. And so they'd go right up to people, interact with them. If they didn't get food or what they wanted, then they could become aggressive. So there was conflict, and I try not to take away from that and lessen that because it is a part of our history. So those perspectives were then brought into children's stories to kind of scare their children to not just wolves, but all predators, and teach them to stay away from them. And then when we started to colonize into the United States, we brought that perspective and that anti-predator belief into the United States. To this day, in the lower 48 states, no one has ever been killed by a wolf. There has been attacks, but no one has ever died in the lower 48 states. But we still have a lot of these perspectives that these wolves are terrifying creatures, and if you see one, it's going to attack you right away. And that has really just been brought through our culture constantly. And it was portrayed a lot here in the Midwest that with wolf populations, because of this negative perspective that they brought here, especially into the Midwest, wolves were eradicated from Wisconsin and Michigan for almost 20 years because of overhunting. And then it wasn't until kind of the late 1960s, early 1970s that we get into the Endangered Species Act, or what was to become the Endangered Species Act, and this big movement for advocacy for predators, that they are important for the landscape. They are great for prey population management, and they're not as horrible as we used to think they are. So, but we still face that today. I have coworkers that said, they told me that they heard stories like Little Red Riding Hood when they were a kid, and they were terrified of wolves until they were into their late teens and early adulthood and learned that maybe those stories didn't have as much foundation as they thought they did.
So does the majority of this folklore that you're citing in the curriculum, does it find its origins during this time period, the 17th, 18th century, or is it even earlier? Like, is this when it all started essentially in terms of the genre of anti-wolf folklore?
Yeah, some of it started in the 16th century, but a bulk of it was in the 17th century. You see a die off in the 18th and 19th century, primarily because the wolf population tanked. They had eradication of populations in a lot of countries, and they just didn't have conflict anymore. And because they were hunting them and getting rid of them as fast as possible. So, but then that's when you start to see the transition of colonization into the United States. So they bring it here. So each country is different and has their own history. There's actually the same version, or like Little Red Riding Hood, that kind of general story is prevalent in multiple different countries. And France is kind of known for starting it. And like the culture of werewolves is pretty prominent, started in France, and Romania, but it has foundations in pretty much every culture, has some kind of story or folklore about humans becoming like either wolves or these monster-like creatures. Mostly they were bad in life, and then in death they become these kind of negative, evil creatures that look like in Romania they have the picolici. If you're a bad person in life, when you die, you become a picolici, which is the personification of the devil and has a wolf head.
Wow.
So
it's interesting because did you find there were any ties to religion and how that basically, like you were just saying just right now, that if you're a bad person in life, when you meet, your death, your passing, you go to the underworld and you come back as this creature? Was it spurred by religion in the church, or was it both religion and social interactions that happened that really spurned this anti-wolf movement?
Yeah. Within Western culture, I feel religion definitely ties into it. You kind of typically have Catholicism and Christianity is related to Western culture. And they tend to have a negative connotation towards nature in general. So forest and nature has more of a, like, it's an unknown. So it's it's a dark place, kind of related to negative, especially when you had like colonization into the United States. But a lot of it was lifestyle based. And because they were primarily agricultural based societies that had like sheep was their primary source of income, that's where this kind of negative connotation came from. But it did, because religion was so intermingled in everything that they did in that time frame, it was really brought into religion as well. But then if you also look at like indigenous cultures, like the Ojibwe people, they see the wolf or the Mayangan as their brother, and he's a part of their creation story. And what happens to one happens to the other. So they see the wolf as a familiar kind of creature within their beliefs. So not every indigenous culture views wolves that way, but a lot of what we would call pagan or polytheism beliefs nowadays, their history with wolves is a more positive and seeing wolves as a teacher more than a negative. But they were more nomadic lifestyle, more interlinked with nature and less at war with it than Western cultures are.
Yeah.
So is the theory then that through, I guess, the management, I mean, it wasn't management back then, but you know what I mean, the management of wolves that were exhibiting, or at least the lethal management of wolves that were exhibiting aggression towards humans, that humans essentially virtually eradicated that type of behavior, at least in average or normal wolf behavior. So that's why we're where we are today, where it's difficult to find any aggressive behavior amongst wolves towards humans.
Yeah, well, you also have to think about in the United States when they colonized here, and then kind of overall, prey species are more abundant. There's less humans per square footage within like wilderness areas. Obviously, depending on what state you are in and what region you're in, there is a lot of overpopulation and conflict. But for the most part, wolves are able to escape that and find a wilderness area that's away. And typically, in their natural habitat and their behaviors, they don't want to be around us. They want to be as far away from us and in their natural habitat as possible. And if they have the prey source to do that, then they're going to. But in that time period, in the 17th and 18th century, they didn't have a choice. They were forced to be close to human populations, which is when conflict occurs.
Right. And there was no there were no regulations about taking game and hunting. And I mean, I mean, what are they going to do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. And this leads it right into, because you kind of, it's really, you tie in 2 and 3 just in what you were talking about, right? Because it's interesting to me that they didn't, and I guess they wouldn't know to understand this and understand the correlation with killing off a lot of the ungulate populations in Europe and how that would lead to wolves going for garbage and being closer to human populations, and that wouldn't transfer over to this new place. I guess our ancestors just thought, we have this abundant prey source for ourselves to feed our families, to farm, to grow, to do everything. And so we're just going to do that. So when you get into module 2 about wolves devastating deer herds, and we see, do you get into, well, we'll into the current yet, but what do you see about the history of that? Is it mostly what you were talking about, that ungulate wolf management is essentially, we're going to wipe out anything that can be a predator and or a competition for our food, and so that's how we'll survive, and that's kind of how they swept across? Was that basically the mindset in those early, that 17th, 18th, 19th century, as everything's getting settled?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when colonizers came to the United States, they saw this beautiful plethora of pelts and prey sources for them to take advantage of. And it seemed so infinite that the idea that they could overhunt seemed impossible, to the point that beaver and white-tailed deer especially were almost eradicated in certain areas, which is crazy to believe now, because like I know here in Minnesota, for example, we have millions of deer. They're everywhere. You see them all the time. But there was a time when they were extremely overhunted. And in the history of ungulate management is kind of similar to wolf management in the way that we, for different reasons, obviously, but we extremely overhunted them and went to the extreme. And then we're like, oh crap, we don't want them to go away. We like having them here. We like hunting them. We like eating them. So then that's when you start to have to put management in place, because what we've learned in natural resources is we don't try to preserve and save until we've brought it all the way to the brink of almost not being so and it was the case for wolves too, obviously for different reasons. It was an anti-predator belief system, so we brought wolves, basically the only wolves left in the lower 48 states were in northern Minnesota back in the 60s, and we have a different picture of that nowadays, but we brought them way back, population way down, and then finally kind of had this big movement of management, and that they are good for the ecosystem, and then started to slowly bring them back up again. So I guess I will point out too, we've been talking about, we've used the word modules and stuff, for the curriculum is designed to address 4 myths about wolves within the Great Lakes region, in the Midwest. So I highlight Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan because that's where breeding wolf populations are at the moment within the Midwest, but it can be expanded to other states as wolves expand. So the top 4 myths are: wolves are dangerous to people, wolves will devastate deer herds, wolves are a major threat to the livestock industry, and that dogs are not safe in areas occupied by wolves. So the curriculum is designed, it has 4 modules, each addressing those 4 different myths. And it's unique in the fact that it can be broken apart. So if an educator only has time to do so many lessons, they can take just module 1 out of the curriculum and do just that. There are 2 lessons within each module, so ideally they do the 2 lessons. But it's 8 hours of material lesson plans. Not every educator has 8 hours to fit into their classroom. So that's why this curriculum is kind of designed to be broken apart in that way. So we've been talking about module 2 is addressing wolves' interactions with deer herds specifically, because in the Midwest, we love our deer so much. And if the wolves have any kind of impact on them whatsoever, it's believed to be negative most of the time. So it's a pretty hot topic.
Yeah. And I apologize for not putting that out there for everyone to understand that the modules is actually the myths, and so it correlates that. So thank you for clearing that up and doing that. Do you find it interesting how I guess we'll stick with the Midwest in this second myth for just a second. Currently, does that draw to ungulates and deer still exist? Is there that love and affection for, not that you wouldn't have love and affection any less for any specific species as time goes on, but you're saying that prior there was, people love the deer, they want to make sure we see the deer, we have enough deer to feed our families and so on and so forth. Has that shifted over time in the current ungulate wolf management as we see it, or has everything just sort of stayed status quo and moved a little bit more in the positive?
Yeah, where you see some negative perspectives on deer is in like heavy agricultural areas, because they cause hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in damage on corn, especially. That usually the federal government is the one that has to cough up the money to help compensate the farmers for their loss. So that's kind of the areas where you see negative perspective on deer. But for the most part, the interactions that you're seeing is a love and a passion for deer and deer hunting specifically. It's a big social thing to do in November, is to get together with your family and your friends and go to your hunting ground, your hunting land, your cabin, or wherever it is, and have that big social interaction that's tied around deer hunting. And what we've seen is a lot of people that grew up in the region grew up in a time when wolves were either completely eradicated from their state or had very low populations. And now the population is starting to bounce back within the Midwest, in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And so deer population is staying the same. It's staying quite steady, but deer behavior is changing. Whereas when there wasn't a lot of predators on the landscape, deer would just kind of stand around and do whatever they wanted and stand in fields because they could. Now we have deer that are getting a little bit smarter and trying to hide and avoid predators because they don't want to be killed. And hunters and people perceive that change in behavior as, oh, the wolves are killing all the deer. There's no deer left. The DNR are lying to us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then you also have some negative interactions with wolves while they're out hunting. I hear a lot of stories of deer hunters. They'll be in their stand and they'll talk about how a pack of wolves like circled them while they're in the tree and they were scared for their lives. And what I like to really point out is one of the biggest ways to attract deer is to mimic them. So you cover them yourself in deer scent and you put on camo and you make deer noises. So wolves hear that and they smell that and they can't see you. So they come up and investigate. And then they usually figure out eventually like, oh, that's a person, not a deer. And then they leave. But a lot of people have had kind of close encounters with wolves because they smell like deer pee and they don't really realize that that's what they're doing, is having that draw in. So.
But where you see negative feelings about deer, are you generally seeing positive feelings about wolves, or is that that correlation not being made in the state?
Yeah. So typically when it comes to attitudes about wolves, in areas where wolves don't live, everyone loves them because they don't have any interactions with them. So here in the Twin Cities, for example, we don't have wolves. So you always see the beautiful, majestic, full winter pelt, like moon in the background, like majestic picture of the wolf. Up north, you tend to have more negative interaction or negative perspectives on wolves, but they've actually done a lot of attitude studies. The DNR has within the 3 states. And they found that it's actually more either neutral or slightly positive perspective on wolves within those areas. Where you see negative perspectives is within hunting communities, primarily deer, and then in Wisconsin, bear hunters have a pretty negative perspective on wolves. But overall, mostly positive attitudes towards wolves, which was genuinely surprising based off of some social interactions. But a lot of people, when asked about not necessarily exact population numbers, but like, do you think that there should be the same amount, more, less, etc., of wolves? Most people say that they want either the same or slightly less, but within those areas where wolves are populated.
That's probably a good migration to the mean, I would imagine, from where it was. I mean, if we're going back with your curriculum and with your studies, we're looking at, 300-400 years ago to get to the point where most people are maybe saying neutral or a little bit less, and that's okay. I mean, that's more of a win, I think, than anyone who's who loves wolves or who is trying to fight for them is probably going to take that as a win. Looking at that, did you, when you're doing the ungulate research, does it parallel with the livestock industry to a degree? Is there any sort of correlation or parallel there when you get into myth number 3, when you're talking about major threat to livestock? Because it almost seems as though people back then are looking at the ungulates in the wild similar to their ungulates that they are farming or growing for beef and meat and things of that sort. Did you find a parallel there or a correlation to how they see their domestic ungulate as opposed and their wild ungulates and how it relates to their relationship with wolves?
Yeah, in Europe, it's pretty well studied that as agricultural practices change, there's less of a negative perspective on wolves. And then there was also a shift in management of wild ungulates. So the population was increasing as livestock management was changing. So there was less conflict in that regard as well. But in that case, wolves were pretty much eradicated by that point in a lot of those regions. So it's kind of hard to do a comparison. Within this area, within the Midwest, there hasn't been, that I found anyways, a lot of studies correlating wild ungulates to livestock and how that influences predator perspectives. There was shifts in agricultural practices. Now it's less kind of mom and pop farms and more like big CAFOs and big production livestock industry where animals are consolidated into like bigger barns and things and not as exposed to predators. But we still do have conflict with a lot of like the smaller privately owned farms where they have a lot of acreage for their livestock to roam. There is funding available through wildlife services to help protect livestock from predation. Some of it works very well, some of it doesn't. It just kind of depends on the region, and wolves are really smart. So you'll usually try one method and it'll work for a little bit, and then you got to try a different method because it stopped working. So in the grand scheme of things, only about 10% of farms are affected by wolves within the region. And you're looking at 300,000 farms in Wisconsin, and only 10% of them are being affected by wolves. So when you look at the numbers, it's pretty low impact on the livestock industry. But the farms that are affected, it's usually repeat offenses. So they're having multiple animals taken. There are a lot of small farms that can't really afford to lose any animal, let alone multiple animals. Or it'll be like a pretty common region. So it'll be like a wolf will attack one farm and they'll use non-lethal programs to protect their animals. So then the wolf will go to the neighbor farm and bug them and then bop around kind of that whole area. Because at the moment, they are listed as threatened in Minnesota and endangered in Wisconsin and Michigan. So they can't use any lethal force. Farmers can't kill wolves or do anything like that. In Minnesota, it's a little bit lighter because they're listed as threatened. So I think they can get permits to protect their livestock. And wildlife services can do lethal abatement, but in Wisconsin and Michigan, they can't do, unless it's human health and safety. If there's a wolf threatening your life, or if there's like reports of wolves becoming too habituated, then they'll go in and remove the problem animal. But otherwise, they can't really do anything lethal.
Got it.
So what can they do? I mean, how in general are they approaching this? If you know, obviously it's limited, but what can they do?
So it's primarily wildlife services. It's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, I think, is the official like long title. They do non-lethal programs. So they do electric fencing, guard animals. So they do guard dogs, which are usually Great Pyrenees, or sometimes donkeys and llamas are actually really aggressive and work really well for guard animals. And then they do what's called flaggery. So it's basically a string with red flags hanging from it that blow in the wind. That usually works really well, like I said in the beginning, until wolves are realizing, oh, it's just a red flag. And then they go right underneath it. And then they do some sound box systems where they basically set up really big speakers to a car battery and play some random radio station at certain times of the day when like wolf conflict is high, to get them, kind of spook them away from the area. They've tried relocation in the past, but it's not very effective. So they don't do that anymore. But those are their go-tos for non-lethal.
So in the curriculum, when they get to myth number 3 or module 3, is the curriculum there to instruct and give them the history and the current of what's happening? And are these methods inside the curriculum to show them, hey, these are ways that our current agricultural system can help coexist with predators? What's the goal of the third myth? Is that, or do you supply that? Is that the stuff we're talking about here?
Yeah. So especially within lesson 2 with current agricultural practices, the goal of this is to highlight, like, yes, there can be conflict on occasion. Like, wolves are animals, and just like any other animal, you can have conflict. So it's not that it doesn't exist. It's just maybe blown out of proportion more than people realize. And then also providing those resources and tools to understand how to mitigate that conflict. So it gives tips for people to do on their own, and then also ways that they can work with wildlife services to bring in non-lethal abatement on their farm, which is completely covered by wildlife services. The farmer doesn't have to pay a dime. So there are different practices that you can do with your livestock, like bringing them in at night and things like that, to make sure that they're protected from not just wolves, but like black bears and coyotes too. They can have conflict with them. So helping mitigate any really negative carnivore interaction that they can manage on their own, and then also bringing in wildlife services as needed.
What was there a specific myth before we get into myth 4 for number 3? Was there anything that was in fables about, because I know, again, when you go back in history 300-400 years ago, you're talking about the creation of werewolves and vampires and witches, all that kind of things. Was that something tied to the wolf in terms of how wolves would take the livestock, whether it be sheep or cattle or cows, and that it was anything other than for prey? Was that something that was carried over also? I don't know if I ever read anything about that. I just wondered.
Yeah. Within a lot of the folklore, like usually if they mention livestock, it's sheep, because that was the primary source of the livestock at the time. They use a lot of, you have to look at like the terminology that they use when they're describing the wolf, like the big bad wolf, like you're looking at that kind of terminology that they're using. And in a lot of those stories, like I mentioned, the Piccolici in Romania, a lot of them are killers. So they kill not just humans, but they also kill sheep. They usually paint it as like just for the fun of it, or like they're not eating them, they're just killing them and leaving them for dead and things like that. So when livestock is mentioned in folklore, it's usually painted as like they're a murderer, like they're killing just for the joy of it and kind of things like that. So a lot of the folklore is targeted towards like human health and safety. Like if you run into this big bad wolf or this werewolf, your life is in danger. And they did that to kind of paint the perspective of like, stay away. If you see a wolf, like don't interact, like that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's usually they're, for lack of a better term, they're a murderer if they're painted in or an interaction with livestock.
I mean, it's wild what was so common then. I mean, to just believe, and now would be like impossible to believe. I was reading part of the curriculum talking about the seventh child. If it's a girl, it's likely to be a witch. If it's a boy, it's likely to be a werewolf. But if a relative says certain prayers or something, it can cure this at the point of baptism. I mean, it's so complicated. But did you come across anything that talks about maybe likely what they actually were observing? Obviously, boys are not turning into werewolves. So what was enforcing these beliefs?
Yeah, a lot of these stories, and within myth and folklore in general, there's usually a glimpse of truth within like every story. So sorry, my cat is batting at a bug on the window. It's really cute. Okay, I'm gonna move out of the sun for a sec. For example, there was a story, I believe it was, I can't remember names, unfortunately, off the top of my head, but it was within the Catholic faith. There was a saint that he was murdered by like pirates or something like that, and they beheaded him and they buried his, or they took his head somewhere else, because in that faith, if you're not buried whole, your soul can't go to heaven. And then with what happened in the story is a wolf found the head and brought it back to the people and returned it so that he could be buried whole and go to heaven. And most likely what happened is the wolf did find the head and was probably chewing on it, and the people saw him with the head and were like, oh yay, the wolf returned it. And then it turned into like this whole story about the wolf saving the day. So there's a nugget of truth usually with these stories, but it's usually like super blown out of proportion.
I mean, in your mind, what amount of this, or what amount of the anti-predator culture that seems to be alive in some communities still, do you think, after all this research, can legitimately be attributed to folklore, like the subconscious impacts of generations of storytelling? Do you think this plays a really meaningful part still?
Oh yeah, I think so.
Really?
I think without people realizing how much of an impact it has on their like socio-cultural perspective on not just wolves, but predators in general, it ingrains a deep fear of predators and nature in general. There's a lot of people, especially like here in like big metro areas, there's a lot of people that are really scared to even go hiking or be in the woods in any capacity, because they have a genuine fear that a wolf or a bear is going to attack them.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Like and it's going to come out of nowhere and it's going to attack them and it's going to kill them and it's going to eat them. And as you know, someone who is an avid outdoorsman, I go outside all the time. I'm more scared of running into other people on the trail than I am any kind of wildlife. So, and that's just through experience. And part of that was also sociocultural, like how I was raised, and the people that I interact with when I was growing up taught me that that was not a healthy or like not a rational thing to think. But when you're growing up in communities where the only stories you're seeing about predators are these negative connotated stories, like there's the Big Bad Wolf cartoon, which is basically like Tom and Jerry, but with a wolf and sheep, that was really prevalent like when my parents were growing up. And if you're a kid watching that and seeing like this big doofus wolf chasing around these sheep and like being this murderer and being quite terrifying to a little kid, at least in my perspective, it's going to paint a pretty negative picture in your head of what a predator is on the landscape.
Right. It's not, I mean, it's also true. What you're saying too is making me think it's not just these old stories, right? It's still happening. I mean,
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings, which is admittedly one of my favorite series, still there's negative connotations of wolves all over that, all over that series. John,
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen it.
Yeah.
The Wog Riders, right? Like, I mean, there's like this big, I mean, it's still happening in shows today. I mean, as of right now, like shows that are actively being.
Yeah, it's still showing wolves with like blue eyes, and they're they're growling, and I think they just had a commercial where it was growling, and there's nothing, they can't just paint the animal as the animal. It has to have some sort of violent connotation, even if it's slight. And they go, "Oh, we almost got out of there." Nope, we got to tweak it just a little bit, just a little tiny bit.
Yeah. Well, and you have, I'm gonna forget the name of it, but the movie with Liam Neeson where he's like
the Gray,
lost out in the woods.
The Gray, yeah.
Oh, right.
Yes,
Yeah.
Super negative connotation about wolves, or the Underworld series with the werewolves
and the lichens.
Like, I love that movie series, but it is not paint a pretty picture for wolves
on earth. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
it's still as prevalent as ever.
Well, you got that.
Yeah, it's Hollywood all the time.
Beauty and the Beast. I mean, if you look at Beauty and the Beast in the animated version, the father gets caught in the woods. He gets chased to the manor where the beast is by wolves because he can't get back because it's late at night. And I'm sure you saw this too. Like when we interviewed John T. Coleman about his book Vicious, it was the same thing, that people would go into they would be transporting goods back and forth. I'm sure you saw this too, Jordyn, right? And the story was, we got trapped in the woods at night and we heard howling. So we feel that we're encircled by a pack of wolves, and whether they all got out, I think for the majority of the time they all got out unscathed. It was just bringing that
the feeling
and the drama to it, because you want to have your feelings or your experience validated to whoever you're going back to. So yeah, it's definitely it's still there.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, and when you're seeing that and having that be a part of your world, whether you're realizing it or not, it's like this subconscious thing telling you, okay, that's scary. I don't want to be around that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wild.
It's so ironic because of all the animals in the woods I'm nervous about encountering, I don't even think wolves shows up in my mind.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's interesting.
I'm more scared of usually coyotes and black bears because they're more habituated usually.
Yeah. It's interesting that there's no that you would think that they would say, okay, bears. And listen, I love bears. I love them. I love mountain lions too. I mean, listen,
and coyotes.
Love them all. So it's just, there should be, I think, a healthy fear of all of them, but an understanding of which ones you really should be terrified and or afraid of if you're hiking or in some, because when we went to Yellowstone, there was, I think we went last April, gosh, it was already almost a year ago, probably more than that. And literally, Jordyn, we landed the day of and they go, a hiker or somebody was mauled by a bear, but they camped out, I think, on one of the feeding trails or something. And you're going to have that run in with an animal that's 400, 500, 600 pounds. And if you're in the way of it, it's, anyway, and I'm not putting negative things on bears. I'm just saying that, you know.
Well, and like statistically speaking, you're more likely to get kicked by a deer than you are to be attacked by a wolf in the Midwest. And there have been wolf conflicts with humans, but a majority of them are the wolf was emaciated or had a head injury or was habituated. Like there was something that caused that negative interaction to more likely happen. And it's not just every day a healthy wolf walks out of the woods and is like, I'm going to attack a human. So it's just not common here.
Yeah.
You do have there has been some deaths by wolves in Canada and Alaska. But those are in areas where they have pretty prevalent hunting seasons and there's like more interactions with wolves on the landscape up there too. So I think that correlates a lot to some of those deaths, but in the lower 48 states, there hasn't been a single recorded death of a human.
I mean, we'd be naive to say that I mean, any animal can be dangerous. Any one of them. I mean, a raccoon can be dangerous to you in certain
Yes.
circumstances. But
Yep.
and of course, we can potentially be dangerous to just about anything. And so it's kind of just nature to have the potential for aggression, the potential for dangerous encounters. But in terms of average behavior and statistics, I don't know how we could justify placing wolves at the top of our list of things to be fearful of. I mean, the cold or extreme heat is more likely to affect
The
you
extreme
negatively
temperatures,
than an encounter with any living animal in the wilderness, let alone a wolf. But
100%. I mean, how does that work, Jordyn, with, because again, we're talking about just being in the woods and obviously, I mean, this probably plays into myth 4, right? With dogs and things like that. What are the differences, I guess, between, because we hear a lot about hunting dogs having interactions because whether, say you're hunting for fowl or things like that, and the dog goes running in the woods and then they have to retrieve whatever it is, and domestic dogs on a hike and things of that sort. What are the numbers there? What does your curriculum say about that interaction? Because as we're talking about this, clearly people, when they go hiking or they go backpacking or camping, they're going to bring their dog. If they have a dog that's well versed in how to be in the outdoors, they're going to bring it there. So what does your curriculum say about that specific myth? And then moving into, say, what's the difference, I guess, between hunting and domestic, and why is there a major difference there, if there is one?
Yeah. As far as domestic dogs' interactions with wolves, they're kind of few and far between as far as negative interactions. Obviously, you're going to have them typically more on the wooded landscape than you are going to be in like the center of town. Where you have conflict with predators and domestic dogs closer to human populated areas is coyotes, because they're more habituated. But with wolves, a lot of it is going to depend on the season. If you're closer to breeding and pup season, there's more likelihood of conflict, especially if you have a dog that's unleashed. You're unsupervised, you're letting it roam around your property, or you're on a walk and it gets away from you, things of that nature. Or if you have multiple dogs and they're being very vocal and like running through the woods, you're more likely to have conflict. So that section of the curriculum addresses that conflict does happen on rare occasions, and how to mitigate that and how to prevent that from happening. And if you do see a wolf and have some kind of interaction with your domestic dog and a wolf, how to react to that situation, what to do if you see a wolf, which is very similar to like human health and safety. It's basically be big, make a lot of noise, try to scare them away as quickly as possible, because they're usually in most situations more scared of you than they are willing to attack your dog. So that's usually how it works for domestic dogs. Excuse me. For hunting dogs, birding dogs, you primarily have very limited conflict, mainly because of when they're being used on the landscape and where they're being used. In like aquatic ecosystems and stuff, you're less likely to have conflict. It's maybe 1 or 2 in each state a year, if that. Where we experience a lot of conflict is with bear dogs, specifically in Wisconsin, because Minnesota doesn't allow hunting of bears with dogs. So they are primarily training their dogs during the spring when wolves are peak territorial season, because they're denning, and they're running them on public land, which is where wolves are primarily living. So the DNR does a lot to try and mitigate that. They have an interactive map on their website where you can see where there's been active conflict, so you can know where to run your dogs and train them in areas where hopefully there won't be any conflict. And if an animal is attacked and it's proven to be a wolf attack, they will compensate you for the cost of the animal. If you are, for example, hunting, when there is a hunting season for wolves in Wisconsin, when they've been not federally protected, you can use dogs to hunt wolves in the later parts of the season. if you have a dog that's killed by a wolf while you're hunting a wolf, that you won't get money for that because of what you're using it for. So there's where the conflict comes with that is the changes in regulations as to when you can run dogs, how many dogs you can have. The regulations have become a lot more lax in Wisconsin, and they're primarily doing it during breeding season, which is a really high territorial season for wolves. So there are tools and techniques out there for trying to prevent as much conflict as possible. But in some of that, it's kind of a risk that you face when you are running a pack of loud hounds through public lands in wolf territory. So there is funding available for that. There are ways to prevent that, but it's a pretty active issue in the area.
It's amazing to me that there's a lot of these safeguards in place, and yet there's still issues with individuals that run into these conflicts and then are looking to vilify the wild animal as opposed to the actions of someone that has, and like you said, it's a risk. So clearly you understand going into whatever you're hunting or training or whatever it is, and understanding that there is a way, there's a possibility. Like Stephen, you said prior, right? Everybody has a certain amount of probability to be violent or reactive towards, a species on a species to species basis, right? Human to human, wolf to human, whatever it may be. That these safeguards are still there, and yet we're still vilifying the wild animal that I'm sure, I think I've said this 1,000 times. Again, it's just trying to eat, sleep, feed its family, and den and have a life, however short that life is going to be. For the most part, we're talking about 4 or 5 years. When you get to the end of this, I think I want to ask this kind of in a joking manner. Did this make your head hurt at all, Jordyn, by going through all of this and understanding just really the historical ramifications? And currently, did you ultimately, when you got to the end, did you see that? I'm sure you saw some change, but were you more surprised at the changes that have been made, or the similarities that are still prevalent from 400 to 500 years ago to now?
Yeah, I think in the grand scheme of things, wolf management within the Midwest and the entire United States has come leaps and bounds and is very impressive in what agencies have been able to accomplish. In this section specifically with dog conflict, it kind of makes me want to bang my head against the wall because there's only so much you can do as far as like laws and regulations and social interactions as well to help mitigate these issues. Unfortunately, you also have people that take advantage of the system. I've heard of hunters will have a dog that's kind of aging out that they don't want to use anymore, so they will purposely train it in high wolf areas to try and have conflict, to try and get money. So, but with that, not all bear hunters have that belief system. Not all bear hunters who have dogs have that belief system. There are still good, positive interactions just as much as there's negative interactions within this regard. And you're going to have that in all aspects of all of these modules, with wolf deer conflict and wolf livestock conflict. Yeah, I guess the more I dived into this, and we've talked about it constantly, the more I'm blown away how our social and cultural beliefs influence all of this. And we don't really have a strong understanding of it. When I was in my undergrad, every professor said it in every class that 90% of wildlife management is people management. So most of the time you're interacting with people more than you're interacting with the wildlife that you're trying to study. So you almost need like a psychology and a sociology degree to study wolves and natural resources, I feel like. So I've learned that is very key to this. I've I've always had a passion for that kind of subset of things, but I learned way more about it just diving into this curriculum. Because like I said in the beginning, the goal of this is to address social change and have this taught in a way that is actually going to be effective. Because you can state facts and talk at people all you want, but you might not really influence social change. So adapting this curriculum to meet those kind of requirements to adjust social behavior and social change is kind of the goal, or is the goal of this whole curriculum. But it was kind of crazy to me, like how much that plays a factor in all of this.
I just have one more question about the dog thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how nuanced this is or whether you've come across the context of this, but you know, I think we all understand the heartbreak of losing dogs, but how did it end up that the government is involved or even is responsible for compensating for dogs that are out hunting? I mean, how did it end up being the justified response to losing a dog that is out engaging in potentially dangerous activities in remote places that the government gets involved? Is the notion that since hunters are providing a service, at least in theory, to wildlife management, that it is owed to them, or what's the notion, or how did this become a thing?
Yeah, I guess I haven't, that I can remember, seeing like a for sure statement as to like why they do this as far as wolf management goes, but my educated guess would be to limit conflict with wolves and to reduce the likelihood of poaching.
It's a tolerance thing.
Yeah. So in Wisconsin, in the Midwest, we have the 3 S's: shoot, shovel, shut up. And it's a very common practice, unfortunately, within the northern communities. And so I think a lot of what these funds available are for the wildlife services and what they do is to help mitigate and manage for those poaching incidents.
So it's a deterrent. They're trying to make it as a deterrent, kind of, right?
Right. I see.
Yeah. So, and yeah, if the goal is to hopefully have them have positive interactions with wildlife services and, you know, have that funding available to them. But some of this you also have to consider when talking about dogs and negative interactions with wolves is the emotional component to this, especially with domestic pets. You can go in and be like, okay, this wolf killed your dog, here's $2,000. But then you also have this owner crying and extremely emotional because they lost their pet. And it's more than just a financial compensation. It's a deep conversation about like the emotional support. And like some hunters view their dogs as tools and don't really have that emotional connection with their dogs. But a lot of hunters do have, they've spent a lot of money and time and emotional interaction with this dog. And to see it killed or seriously injured by wolves can be very emotional for them. And so you have that emotional piece that plays into it too. So I think it's not just the financial side of it, but the social interaction and the putting a face to the government name. Like you're having a specific agent coming out to you, you know their name, you have their business card, you have that social interaction. So if you have conflict, you have someone to talk to about it instead of like this overarching big government agency.
Right. I mean, is there any evidence that compensating for dogs has had a positive effect on social tolerance? Or
I know they've done studies about the tolerance capacity for wolf populations in relationship to lethal and non-lethal management. In terms of livestock, they have found that there's actually more of a positive viewpoint on management if, like, when they're delisted and they're, game species within the state, if they're not federally protected, farmers and ranchers can have a tag that if they see a wolf causing issues on their landscape, with their cattle, they can shoot it. 90% of them don't ever use that tag, but the confidence of just having it in their hand and knowing that they can use it tends to cause more of a positive attitude towards management and wolf population management as a whole, because they have that option.
That
So
makes sense.
I can't necessarily speak to hunting dogs and that kind of relationship. I'm sure it's been studied, but I'm not an expert on that
Just
regard.
curious.
Yeah.
But I know when it comes to livestock, they've tend to see some
Some
positive
stuff.
outcomes come out of
Yeah.
it, which is really nice.
I wonder too if they've ever considered maybe doing, and I don't know who would be open to it on that side, but maybe some counseling. I mean, if there's a great sort of a grief counseling situation, because if there's a way that they can, again, who knows if anyone would take it up, but at least maybe as an option to have, you know, even a session or two with someone who can, so they can process it, as opposed to, like you say, just going in, getting your funds, obviously being emotional about losing your pet and your companion, and then just going right back to it. I wonder if there's a correlation there eventually down the line that they would consider, because at least as an option, it goes, oh, okay, we're going to give you financial compensation, but on the other side, if you want to take advantage of this program that we have someone who you can at least speak out to and talk and get angry with and do whatever. So maybe that could be something, hopefully in the future, that they maybe consider as a way that, you know, to grieve. I mean, listen, we deal with death a lot in our lives, you know, and sometimes it's good to talk it out, and maybe that'll just maybe ease that a little bit and just bring the temperature down, as opposed to going in and doing that. Would be a nice thing. Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it's almost like we need a curriculum on deflating myths about wolves out there.
It's almost like we need one of those.
It's not like we
Anyone
need
who writes curriculums,
things, right? Can someone write that? Oh, Jordyn already did it.
Yeah. Well, and I know a lot of wolf educators within the region that they talk about these 4 myths and these topics every day in their classroom, but they didn't have like a unified tool that brought all of this together in one compact thing. So that's kind of been the biggest kind of comment or compliment about this curriculum that I've been getting from educators that teach about wolves every day, is that this is a very essential tool for like putting all of that research and those facts together in one healthy document. And this is going to be helpful for not just wolf educators, but also nature educators in general, or really anyone that wants to talk about wolves in any capacity, because they're a great learning tool for all different subjects. So
Exactly.
And how did you choose your advisory group?
Yeah, so my advisory council was Ken Gilbertson was the chair. He's the director for the Center of Environmental Education. His primary focus with environmental education is adult level education. So that was a big help for me in comparison to a lot of the other professors focused on like pre-K or K through 12. And then he also, in his free time, has a huge passion for wolves. So we had a lot of conversations about that. And then Dorothy was my other member on the advisory council. She is one of the board members for the Timberwolf Alliance. She does a lot of non-formal education for a university in northern Michigan in the UP. So she does a lot of public advocacy and things like that, and public education in the non-formal setting. So she was a really great tool, as well as being involved in Timberwolf Alliance and knowing a lot about wolves. And then Nathan Meyer was my other advisory council member, and he once again had a lot of great skills within adult level education and environmental education in general. He's currently getting his finishing a PhD in doing environmental education work with his PhD under Ken, my chair. So they have a really great relationship. And then I didn't implement this in a classroom and like kind of trial and test it for my thesis just because of time and things like that. But I have, through the International Wolf Symposium and other conferences that I've presented at, I have shared this curriculum with other educators already. within the wolf world and kind of beyond, and have had like a lot of really positive feedback. Kind of next steps is I want to make specific presentations for each section. So I can either myself or others can go in and teach educators about this subject, or educators can use this in their classroom to talk about the background material before implementing the lesson plans. And then, the goal, the hope is that this curriculum will constantly grow. Like I said, in the beginning, it's designed for adult level education in the non-formal setting, but I want it to be way more than that. I want it to go through K through 12, formal setting, non-formal setting, and to bring other cultural perspectives into it, and just like have it constantly be a growing document.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. I love it. This is what you've laid out is an incredible tool, and I think anybody who's listening to this it would really behoove them to take a look at this and contact you and really go through the steps about this, because I think this is valuable information and really just a look back at our history and understanding why we are who we are and what we believe and forcing it upon this specific species. My last question for you, Jordyn, is when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
I guess I will say that the thing that comes to my mind when I picture wolf in my head is the classic wolf, full winter coat, standing on a cliff with the moon in the background. I have like 6 t-shirts that have that on there. Like, I'm a sucker for symbolism. So, but I think at the end of the day, human beings like to personify like emotion onto everything. We do it with our pets. I do it with my cats all the time. And we tend to do it with wildlife. And we have both perspectives. We have wolves as the villain, but then we also have the other side where people paint wolves as this like angelic creature on the landscape. And at the end of the day, like you said, wolves are just trying to eat, drink, sleep, support themselves, kind of just live and function every day. And so we need to sometimes step back and take away that symbolism and that personification and realize like they're just a wild animal.
Mm-hmm.
Just like we are in a way, we're just trying to eat, sleep, drink water and function. So.
Pretty much. Yeah. So where is this publicly available? How do people see the stuff we're talking about? Is there a website where they can see it? Is there a PDF? How can people look through this curriculum and see if it's for them?
Yeah. So at the moment it is on the University of Minnesota Duluth archives. So it's accessible through that. Otherwise it is like you guys, I shared it with you, the link, it is in a Google Drive with not just the curriculum itself, but the entire thesis project, as well as a lot of really great resource material and lesson plans and things like that. There's no fee to access that or anything. Is completely free to use. It's just people reach out to me and then I share the link with them. So I don't know how you want to like post my email or whatever.
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. Yeah, once we stop, we'll talk about that. But we will. Those of you that are listening that want to take a look at this awesome curriculum, we will have links so that you guys can check it out. Maybe even email Jordyn and you can connect with her on a personal level. But Jordyn O'Gara, this is awesome. You're rocking it. We love this. Thank you for giving us a large amount of your time and really diving into this curriculum that you spent many years putting together. So kudos to you. And this was fantastic. Thank you so much. Just stick around for a minute when we're done.
Thank you. Yeah. And I would like to point out too, this was designed for the Midwest, but would love to work to expand this and use this as a platform or like a base to do other regions. I've been talking to some people about doing the Mexican gray wolf recovery program curriculum for them. And you guys out in California, everyone needs education. So
hey, let's do it. Let's spread this thing worldwide. We'll do it. We'll get it done. So Jordyn O'Gara, thanks again. House to you all out there. Stephen, I'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the donate tab, and find out more information.